Today, today I'm continuing with a sub-series on philosophy, and in this episode, I'll delve into sources of knowledge according to DTM. I won't deal with all the sources in this episode. There are many there, and I'll take my time to do it step by step. But before I go there, let's look at past week. And the thing that struck me most was the corruption of the Trump family, which was so obvious in the visit to Western Asia. His sons, Eric and Donald, already traveled extensively before the visit, drumming up business for the Trump organizations, which they are running in their father's name while he's in the White House. And Eric Trump announced plans for an 80-story Trump Tower in Dubai. He attended a cryptocurrency conference there with Zach Witkoff, a founder of the Trump family crypto company, who is named World Liberty Financial, and who is the son of Trump's Mid-Eastern Ukraine advisor, Steve Witkoff. So the son of Witkoff and the son of Trump are doing business, and they have been doing that for many years. And now the father comes up and, clears all the obstacles that might be there, including, building a luxury golf resort in Qatar, partnering with Qatari Dayar, a real estate company backed by the country's sovereign wealth fund. The family is leasing its brands to two new real estate projects in Saudi Arabia's capital, Riyadh, in partnership with Dar Global, a London-based luxury real estate developer and a subsidiary of private Saudi real estate firm Al Arqam. And Trump's organization has partnered with Dar Global on a Trump Tower set to be built in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and an upcoming Trump International Hotel and luxury golf development in neighboring Oman. The President of the United States is going to Western Asia, all these countries, and doing business for his private family companies. He announced in January 20 billion investment funds for US data centers promised by Damak Properties, which is an Emirati company led by billionaire Dubai developer Hussain Sajwani. And Trump's argues, that as benefiting the country's technological and economic standing, that is about that, and rather his family business. But Sajwani was a close business partner of the Trump family before the 2016 election. So what these people are doing, if this was an African country where the president facilitates his family business, his friend's business, everybody in the West would shout, look, this is corruption. And the media treat it as business as usual. Now, let's move on DTM philosophy. What is knowledge? I define knowledge as a collection of insights and understanding about the natural and social world as expressed in concepts. And concepts are units of knowledge that describe and explain certain aspects of the social and natural world. So we'll go into what a concept is in coming videos. But important to know that insights and understanding is not only about true and false, but also about right and wrong. So ethics is part of knowledge. And then you go into the question, how is knowledge produced? Obviously through observation, through reasoning, and then observation and reasoning has become the main instruments for knowledge production in Western philosophy. And then there are other: common sense, innate knowledge, social interaction, revelation, imagination, and creativity. I'll go into all these sources, and they have been discussed in Western philosophy and in other philosophies, but they were relegated to the background, and observation and reasoning came the foundation of Western philosophy and Western science. In the Western philosophy, in this theory of epistemology, knowledge is produced by scientists. And so the scientist is the knowledge producer, and he follows certain rules of the scientific methods, which I'll go into later, and they discover true and false. In DTM, we say everybody can produce knowledge, and there are certain types of knowledge, like common sense and innate knowledge, that everybody uses every day and produces every day. And obviously you have the scientists, natural science, social science, philosophers, mathematicians. You have spiritual leaders who are strong in that aspect of knowledge which has to do with ethics. You have the activists who are trying to change society, and in that process produce knowledge. Now, in the Western academia, the scientific method is being taught as the only valid method of producing knowledge. And I'll take some quotation of a representative book by Anil Bhattacharya, and the book is about social science research, the principles, methods, and practices, but it can be easily used also for the natural sciences. So he says the purpose of science is to create scientific knowledge, and scientific knowledge refers to a generalized body of laws and theories to explain a phenomenon or behavior of interest that are acquired using the scientific method. So he's distinguished scientific knowledge as a specific type of knowledge, which is valid knowledge, and that is looking into the laws of nature or social laws. Laws, he says, are observed patterns of phenomena or behaviors, while theories are systematic explanations of the underlying phenomena or behavior. So that is what everybody is being trained in university. You're trained in observation and reasoning in the natural sciences. You try to figure out what are the natural laws, how does nature function according to natural laws. In social sciences, you figure out what are the patterns of behavior, how do we explain it, and can we explain it by certain social laws. And then he says the scientific method refers to a standardized set of techniques for building scientific knowledge, so as how to make valid observation, how to interpret results, and how to generalize those results. So the scientific method is what everybody on the globe and the universities are being taught in the first year. And then he says, look, the scientific methods of inquiry has two possible forms: inductive and deductive research. Inductive research, that is the goal of the researchers, is you collect data and you try to infer theoretical contrasts and patterns for the observed data. And in deductive research, the goal is you have a concept or theory about the patterns of the laws, the social and natural laws, which you have derived from empirical data. Now you have new data, and so you are testing whether the new data affirms or denies a theory. So that's why he calls inductive research is theory building and deductive research is theory testing. And then he says, but if you do this, you have 4 criteria. One is reliability, which means others should be able to independently replicate or repeat a scientific study and obtain similar, if not identical, research. So a scientist studies, let's say, the the moon, the objects in the universe, and when he comes to a conclusion, oh, for example, the universe is expanding, then other people should be able to do the same observations and get the same results. That's reliability. And then precisions. So if you have theoretical concepts, which are often hard to measure, you must define it with such a precision that others can use those definitions to measure those concepts and test the theory. So your theory should be translated into measurable units. And what are those measurable units? That these are, you will get independent and dependent variables. Basically, you get mathematics involved that enables you to test, to collect measurable data, and that then you use your theory, to test, use the data to test the theory. And then he said the theory must be stated in a way that it can be disproven. Theories that cannot be tested or falsified are not scientific theories, and any such knowledge is not scientific. A theory that is specified in imprecise terms or whose concepts are not accurately measurable cannot be tested and is therefore not scientific. Now, the whole criteria of falsifiability, which was introduced, by this British philosopher, was basically aimed at Marxism, because he argued that Marx and Marxism formulated theories that could not be tested, which is, by the way, not correct, because if Marx says through concentration you get bigger companies and leads to monopolies, that's are things that can be tested, whether it's true or not true, whether or not it's true or not. Then the last criterion is parsimony, and he says when there are multiple explanations of a phenomena, the scientist must always accept the simplest and logically most economical explanation. So these are 4 criteria that you use and that people, first year students, are trained in to do this type of research. And then he says there's a research cycle. You have the observation phase. You observe natural or social phenomena, or events, or behavior. In the rationalization phase, you try to make sense of it, try to figure out what are the laws. And in the validation phase, you test the theory using additional data. Now, here's important. He says there's no different approach for knowledge about nature and knowledge about human beings. So they classified science into natural sciences and social sciences. And the natural science is the science of naturally occurring objects or phenomena, so as light and matter and earth, celestial bodies, or the human body even. And natural science then can be further classified into physical science, earth science, and life science. And physical science consists of disciplines such as physics, that studies physical objects, chemistry, the science of matter, astronomy, the science of celestial objects. The earth science consists of disciplines such as geology, the science of the earth, and life science include disciplines such as biology, the science of human bodies, and botany, the science of plants. And in contrast, social science is the science of people or collections of people, such as groups, firms, society, economies, and the individual and collective behavior. And then it could be classified in subdisciplines such as psychology, science of human behavior, sociology, science of social groups, economics, science of firms, markets, and economies. So all these sciences and all these disciplines use the same method. And then he says, yes, what about bias? Well, theories, he said, might have implicit cultural assumptions, whether they apply to individualistic or collective cultures, temporal assumptions, whether they apply to early or later stage of human behaviors, spatial assumptions, whether they apply to certain localities but not for others. So if a theory is to be used and tested properly, all of these implicit assumptions that form the boundaries of the theory must be properly understood. Unfortunately, theorists rarely state their implicit assumptions clearly, which leads to frequent misapplications of theories to problem situation research. So he's saying, yes, there is bias possible, but if you are a good scientist, you are aware of the pitfalls that can lead to these biases. And once you know that, you can avoid it. So this is how every university student is trained, with this kind of assumptions. I'll show you in the videos to come that this scientific method is false. It has limited applications and it doesn't lead you to understand the world as it is. So I'll go into it in detail in the coming videos. But for this video, I'll focus on the sources of knowledge. And as you see, in the scientific method, the sources of knowledge are only limited to observation and reasoning. Now I'll talk to you about common sense as a source of knowledge, which is not accepted in the scientific method, which is one weakness already. If I ask you what is the weaknesses of the scientific method, which is presented as universal and valid, then they would exclude common sense as a source of knowledge. And I define common sense as the cumulative knowledge of a community that has been passed on through generations to members of the community and is regarded as basic truth. Now, some European philosophers acknowledge this as a valid source of knowledge. I mentioned different philosophical textbooks, and you'll come across the names of Thomas Reid from Scotland in the 18th centuries, J.A. Moore in the 19th centuries and the 20th centuries, are philosophers who acknowledge, European philosophers who acknowledge common sense as a valid source of knowledge. And then you get the critique of the major philosophers, which led to discarding this as a source of knowledge, which is Descartes, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, who had a huge impact on European philosophy and basically argued that common sense is not a valid source of knowledge. So Descartes says senses can deceive you, and therefore sometimes you can't distinguish an illusion, a dream from reality, and therefore because it can deceive you, your senses, this is not a valid source of knowledge. The question of common sense. Hume says common sense beliefs are psychologically ingrained habits and not rationally justified truths. He says common sense assumes the future will resemble the past. The sun will rise again tomorrow, for example, which is not a logical proven thing. It's a habit of the mind to think that is the case. So if you say, oh, the sun will rise tomorrow, and say that is common sense, he would say, no, it's a habit, if you say it like that. If you study the law of nature and how the planets relate to each other, then it's science, but not a sentence like the sun will rise tomorrow. and say this is common sense. And then Immanuel Kant, he says, all our knowledge begins with the senses, proceeds then to the understanding, and ends with reasoning. So there's nothing higher than reason. And common sense can explain phenomena like reason can. So he says the weakness of common sense is you say something but it's not an explanation. It's just a description. Now, these things are valid critique. It's not nonsense that they are saying. The nonsense is by saying because of this invalidity, it is totally useless. And that's where DTM comes and say, no, common sense has its weaknesses and its strengths. And if you use the weaknesses to discard the strength, you're making a big mistake. I'm interested, DTM is about three things: a critique of Eurocentrism, a search into alternative in other civilizations, and the creation of a new knowledge with its practical implications. So that's why I always look, okay, where did other civilizations talk about common sense? And then you'll find there are views about it. In the Indian philosophical schools, you have Aksapada Gautama in the 2nd century BCE, who founded the Nyaya school, which goes into logical reasoning and perception as valid source of knowledge. And then he uses the concept of everyday practical knowledge. It should be scrutinized through logic, but he acknowledges that everyday practical knowledge is a valid source of knowledge. And he warns against uncritical reliance on common sense, because there might be bias, there might be error. For example, mistaking a rope for a snake in dim light shows perceptual fallibility. So, but then, you could say you could easily mistake a snake for a rope, but you won't mistake a snake for an elephant. So common sense has its weakness and yet still its strength. And then they argue common sense guides social duties and must be aligned with scripture, authority, and recent ethics. So you don't look at common sense in and of itself, but also how common sense is embedded in community history and traditions. A similar thing you see in Chinese philosophy, when Confucius stresses that the gentleman internalizes Li and Ren to navigate life with property. So Li is the ritual and social norms that guide behavior and function as a cultivated forms of common sense. So knowing how to act in a familiar and social role reflects shared ethical understanding. And Ren is the benevolence and empathy inform, and they inform moral judgment. So he says if you take these two principles into account, then common sense is embedded in it. And Mencius and other Chinese philosophers argues that moral common sense is innate. Next time I'll talk about innate knowledge. So the Chinese have this sense, this view on common sense. In Africa, in the Akan philosophy in Ghana, the concept of practical wisdom blends reason with culturally embedded norms. So there's a proverb that says, if you forget, you will be reminded when you reach the broken pot. So, and this underlines that learning is from a collective experience, and you as an individual might not know it, but once you reach the experience of a community, then you'll gain knowledge from that community. That's why said common sense is knowledge that has been accumulated in a community collectively and transferred to the members of the community. And then you have the Gambian proverb, if your only tool is a hammer, you will see every problem as a nail. That is a common sense knowledge of how people create problems because they think that there's only one instrument that you have to solve problems. And the prophets are often referred to as prophets rather than common sense and collective historical wisdom. If you see the phrase, I think, therefore I am, you don't say it's a proverb. You say it's philosophy. Why? Because these proverbs philosophical, there's a philosophical reasoning behind it. And because a proverb is in the oral tradition, we don't have the reasoning behind it, but even if you don't have the reasoning available, you could think about what the philosophical reasoning would be. And therefore, for me, I think, therefore I am, is as philosophical as the Gambian proverb, if your only tool is a hammer, you'll see every problem as a nail. So I wouldn't call it a proverb, I would call it philosophy. Now, how do we view common sense from a DTM perspective? First, we acknowledge the weak side. Senses can defeat us. Then we acknowledge the strong side. We can mistake a rope for a snake, but we will not mistake a rope from an elephant. Then we apply common sense not as a universal general rule, but use the strengths on a case-by-case basis. And then we use common sense as a method of critique to deconstruct what I call expert stupidity. You have expert knowledge and you have expert stupidity, and destroy the authority of knowledge. And I'll give you two examples. One, in the social science. There was, in the history of slavery in the United States, in the historiography of it, there was a racist historian called Ulrich Bonald Phillips, a white historian, and he was regarded for a long time by colonial historians as the ultimate authority on US slavery because he meticulously studied the plantation records from which he constructed a narrative that was essentially racist. For example, he writes, "The question remains and may long remain whether the manner in which the Negroes were brought into touch with civilization resulted in the greater blessing or the greater curse. That manner was determined in part, at least by the nature of the typical Negroes themselves, impulsive and inconstant, sociably and amorous, volubly and dilatory and negligent, but robust, amiable, obedient, and contented. They have been the world's premium slaves." Basically, this is your common sense tells you this is just ultimately racist. And then he came under attack, strong attack, and in an effort to conceal his racism, one of his followers, a historian, Dillon, makes a story that is complex and confusing. He says, Phillips lost in repute less because of his mistaken perception and faulty scholarship. Charity might have forgiven him his lapses in this respect, as others in his fields have been forgiving theirs. So he's saying the reputation of Phillips has been damaged not because the things he was saying, his research was good, he collected the records, and he made a few errors, yes, everybody makes errors. And then he said, he was not, and then he said, what was wrong was not that his scholarship was wrong, but he doesn't say what a later era wants and needs to hear. So he say later on, now people who acknowledge this as racist, they don't want to hear because it's another era. it's about subjectivity. And he was objective in his era, and this era doesn't want to hear it. He says he was not egalitarian, he was an aristocrat, and he was a historian of aristocracy. So he names criminals, people who enslave other people are criminals. He says these are aristocrats. He takes a crime out of the concept and makes it something neutral. He believes in hierarchy of people and of principles. He valued a moral code in which responsibility, duty, sacrifice, and sublimation predominate. In short, he admired too much in principle and behavior that is now recessive. The theorem responds, if you apply common sense, you say, Bonnell studied hard to say a lot of nonsense. So Philip is talking a lot of nonsense, and common sense calls it nonsense. And in their circle, they think they are doing on science. They're conducting scientific conversations. I'll give you one from the mathematics department, the Ramanujan series. Experts, mathematical experts, I'll show the video in a minute. Experts who talk a lot of nonsense, they go to lay people like me and you and present something which your common sense tells you this is nonsense, but because they are expert, you have to trust their judgment. And I'll go to the video, I'll stop now and then and tell you that how stupidity, expert stupidity, is masked and created and manipulated, and that common sense deconstruct all this. So let's go to the video here. Okay, the guy takes a book and says, the result is astounding, you don't expect it, but mind you, it's used in physics in many places. So I go to the physics books, I look up the page, and I try to figure out, it's a book on string theory, I try to figure out where is the application in physics? None. Never in the book you'll find an application of this formula in physics. So what he shows you is a page where there's a statement that this exists, this formula exists, but you won't find anywhere in the book the application. Because if you would find the application, why didn't he mention the application? This is manipulation of the mind. This is fooling people by taking an authority, misusing it, manipulated by showing the statement but not the application, and then letting you believe that what your common sense is telling you, hey, this is nonsense, 1 plus 2 plus $3, I get a lot of dollars, and at the end I end up in debt. Common sense will tell you this is nonsense. But he continues. What a nonsense. Because you just take the average of 2, 1 plus 0, and then you say, okay, this is the answer. And then you say, oh, I can prove it in other ways, but you don't prove it. And you expect me to believe that it is a half. While common sense tells you there is no answer. It can't, there's no definite answer because it's infinite. And infinity is indefinite. So if you have an indefinite series, you will never get a definite answer. It's logical. Common sense tell you that. If you do, obviously, you will make an error. And this is the first error you make, that you think that an infinite series has a definite answer. You could have an approximate answer, but not a definite answer. So let's go on. All right. So what you get is fantasies. You play around with formulas, you play around with data, you get something which is a bit weird, you discard common sense that tells you, hey, something is not right here, and then you present it as science. And that type of reasoning is not only in mathematics and physics, you have it also in social science a lot. In economic theories, you have people giving detailed mathematical explanations of economic laws, which are basically moral laws. And I recommend to look at the work of my brother Asad Saman from Pakistan, who's doing a lot of interesting work on the ethical foundation of Western economic theory. And they present it as science. And I think common sense is an instrument to use to deconstruct this kind of nonsense. So let me go to here. For next time, I'll go into the other sources of knowledge. But for now, I would say if you discard a particular important source of knowledge, common sense, then you open the door to produce nonsense and present that as science. And the nonsense, common sense can tell you that this is the nonsense as a stepping stone to deconstruct the things that they were doing. And in this case, the basic error was in having an infinite series and then take an average which only applies to finite series and then say, hey, this is a physical law. And as I said, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus $4 doesn't put you in debt. That is what common sense tells you. Okay, talk to you next week.